Welcome everyone for the final webinar in our 2021 webinar series on genetics in ALS. For those of you who haven't joined us so far, I'm your host and moderator today. My name is Kristiana. I work at the Montreal Neurological Hospital, and I'm leading a Canadian strategy to improve access to genetic testing for people living with ALS. We're joined today by Dr. Nita Farahany. I'll introduce her more in just a second. She's going to be joining us for a conversation today on the ethical considerations for genetic testing in ALS. As a reminder, we've already had 2 previous webinars. Oops. The Introduction to ALS MND Genetics and Genetic Counseling and Testing in ALS MND are both available on the Alliance's website as recordings, so we highly encourage you to go check both of those out. And today is the last webinar in our series on ethical considerations. The learning objectives for today are to outline ethical considerations for genetic testing in ALS and to understand the risks and benefits of genetic testing for individuals living with ALS, regardless of their family history, and individuals who have a family history of ALS. If you have any questions, please submit your questions in the Q&A box or the comment box, and myself and Nita will be joining you for the live Q&A at the end of this session. And stop sharing my screen so we can join Nita. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Nita Farahany, who is the Robinson O. Everett Distinguished Professor of Law and Philosophy at Duke University and the founding director of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. From 2010 to 2017, she served as commissioner on the U.S. Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She's a widely published scholar on the ethical, legal, and social implications of the biosciences and emerging technologies, a frequent commentator for national media and radio shows, and a speaker at major event conferences, including the Aspen Ideas Festival, TED Talk, and the World Economic Forum. Thank you for joining us today, Nita.
Thanks for having me, Kristiana. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk about the benefits and burdens of genetic testing and the ethics that are surrounding this complicated but exciting area of progress.
Thank you for joining us. So I have a series of questions to guide us through a conversation today. Do you want to start with just setting the stage for a few minutes on your perspectives on this topic?
Sure. So as Kristiana mentioned, I'm Nita Farahany. I'm a professor of law and philosophy at Duke University, where my area of focus is really at the intersection of the ethics of emerging technologies. And primarily I focus on genetics and neuroscience and artificial intelligence. That intersection brings me to a number of different issues and gives me an opportunity to work with a lot of different corporations. And so, for example, I've worked with Biogen on their recent clinical trials, helping them to think through the ethics of how to structure the trial, how to think about things like data security and data privacy. My own personal perspective on genetic testing in areas like ALS is that there's great promise for individuals, but there's also risks. And in thinking about it, I feel like people need to be fully informed to understand what the benefits, but also the burdens of genetic testing are, so that they can go in with fully informed consent. They can take whatever steps that would be necessary to truly both be fully informed, but also to protect themselves against any risk and downside of it. And I think about the population of people who are undertaking genetic testing in buckets, really, which is those people who may already be diagnosed with ALS and be symptomatic for ALS, for example, those individuals who maybe have a family history but don't personally experience any symptoms of ALS, and a third bucket, which is there are a lot of people who are starting to undertake genetic testing. For example, I did 23andMe when it first came out. I've also had whole genome sequencing done in the years since then. And there's a lot of things that you learn from that genetic testing that may be a surprise, maybe things that you didn't anticipate. And one of them, although uncommon, could be that you also test positive for one of the variants that are known to contribute to ALS. And given that there is a large variety of difference between different kinds of genetic contributions to ALS, understanding that, interpreting that, knowing how that affects you in your life really is something that I like to think about and try to help educate people about.
Great, thank you. As you said, this is a really hot topic right now in ALS, and we've gone through 2 webinars already. One, laying the foundation of, what DNA is, how we inherit it, and how we get genetic diseases, and speaking a bit to how we're developing therapies to target those diseases. And then we had a second webinar really highlighting what a genetic counselor does, what genetic counseling is, the different specialties involved. And so today, I like your approach. You're approaching this situation to be fully informed, so understanding all of the risks and the potential benefits that come along with it. So I like also how you classified this as buckets. So we'll start with symptomatic individuals. So somebody who's currently living with ALS, who has been diagnosed with ALS. Genetic testing can help researchers and clinicians better understand their disease, or could open the possibility of being eligible for a clinical trial of a genetically targeted therapy. However, what are some of the considerations that such an individual would need to take with regard to their family members and their potential risk?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kristiana. So one thing about genetics, of course, is that it tells you information not just about yourself, but also potentially about your relatives, about children, if you already have them, or if you're thinking about children, about other members of your family. And those other members of your family may not personally be that excited to receive that information themselves. And so I think information can be incredibly empowering. In all the ways that you said, it can be really helpful. It also can be really helpful for people to think about things like family planning or financial planning, or thinking about and planning for their future. And a lot of studies have been done on individuals who are symptomatic with ALS and who have undergone genetic testing, showing that psychologically they experience a benefit from undergoing that genetic testing and learning about the information. Nevertheless, it does have implications, as you asked, for family members. And those implications, for example, could be that it has social and emotional effects on other people who are within the family. It could reveal information about other people in the family, such as their increased risk of having the same mutation. It also potentially could impact them and create kind of strife within the family. So sometimes we see that there's increased marital strife, for example, when an individual is diagnosed with not just ALS, but also with genetically positive contribution to ALS. That also could have implications, for example, for family members as they think about things like life insurance. So in some countries, there are protections against life insurance, discrimination based on genetic information that a person has in their profile. But in other countries, there isn't protection. And life insurance companies, for example, can ask, have you undertaken genetic testing? And if so, disclose those genetic testing results. And testing positive for a genetic contribution to ALS could be a reason for being denied life insurance. That likewise could be true for a family member who isn't symptomatic and who the information about the family member who was tested reveals the possibility, for example, that they also may have a genetic mutation that would give rise to ALS.
Great, thank you for that overview. So in addition to considerations regarding direct family members, there's also important emotional and social considerations. So in considering having genetic testing as someone who's diagnosed with ALS, genetic testing can also be an option for individuals who are not currently symptomatic. So family members of someone who has been diagnosed with ALS and is gene positive, but who have family members who are affected by genetic variation. What would someone need to consider in this position? So they have been identified as having a gene that is causing their ALS, and they have family members who are weighing the pros and cons of getting testing.
Yeah, so it's a tough choice for somebody who has a family member who is tested positive for ALS, and they're deciding themselves if they want to undergo genetic testing. And there's a lot to weigh there. I think part of it is thinking about age of the individual and when they might undergo that kind of genetic testing. One of the things that's challenging about genetic testing, of course, is that it doesn't tell you when, it tells you the likelihood, and not all genes that are implicated in ALS have high penetrance. That is, they don't tell us that without a doubt the person is going to develop ALS. They simply tell us an increased risk of developing ALS. And so you, as you contemplate undergoing genetic testing, I think one of the things I would want to know is, what is the nature of the genetic variation that my relative has tested positive for who is symptomatic for ALS? If it's some of the variants, for example, of SOD1 that are highly penetrant, I personally would probably want to know if I have that, because it would be a greater certainty. It also, as you said, would give me the opportunity potentially of enrolling in some clinical trials. There may be therapies that are available to it, but that's true for also other genetic variants that are less penetrant. A big challenge in this area, though, is thinking about if there isn't a treatment available, if you aren't eligible for a clinical study, does the knowledge itself benefit you in some way, or does it harm you in some way? And for most people, when they undergo that kind of testing, there is initially, if they test negative, great relief, for example, that and they can live with the knowledge that they don't have that genetic variant. That can be really helpful. They may also feel guilty that they've tested negative while other family members have tested positive. And so there's the psychosocial component that they're really going to have to address and grapple with. For people who learn that they have a highly penetrant or even a moderately penetrant genetic mutation that gives rise to ALS, they may experience sadness, but also have to grapple with the uncertainty and ambiguity that it now introduces into their lives. They already had a good bit of that ambiguity and uncertainty because they have a family member who has ALS. But this adds to that, knowing that they have tested positive for it as well. It can help, though, in helping them think about, for example, family planning. Like, suppose you want to have children and you've discovered that you have a gene that causes ALS, or that is highly penetrant or even moderately penetrant for ALS. You may choose to undergo family planning in a different way. Like, for example, you could decide to use treatments like in vitro fertilization that would allow you to screen embryos and screen against, for example, that genetic contribution, if that's what you wanted to do. It may also lead people to make different choices about family planning than they might otherwise have with that knowledge. For a lot of people, they actually feel like it makes them more present and to find greater life meaning to know this information. And so it's not all psychological downside. Many people integrate these kinds of difficult learnings and information from genetic testing and then use that information to bring families closer together, to decide and be much more deliberate about how they live their life, or to really feel empowered, for example, to be an activist in the ALS community, understanding what they've learned and how they themselves are impacted directly and also indirectly through a family member who's tested positive.
It's such a personal decision. And I know so many people who have gone through that, some that have proceeded with predictive testing and some that haven't. And the components and the considerations that they bring in, it's always so personal. And a lot of what we know in this space, we've pulled from our learnings from Huntington's disease as an example, but there's still so much that we need to do in terms of research on the psychosocial impact in ALS in particular, because it's such a more complex disease genetically. So it's still a very, very personal decision. So you touched on insurance already, and that's a bit of a hot topic. You often see questions about insurance and about how genetic testing can affect someone's ability to get insurance. So both individuals living with ALS who have genetic variations inherited in their family, and those who are not living with ALS currently, who are not symptomatic, but who have a family member affected by genetic form of ALS. What considerations do they need to take with regard to insurance more specifically, and the risk of genetic discrimination? And I know you've done some research on other countries and jurisdictions beyond the US as well. So can you help us guide through what some of these challenges are?
Yeah, this is one of the hard areas I think about genetic testing. I mean, there's so many hard areas. It is a deeply personal choice, as you said, an empowering choice for many people, but also one that brings and introduces some risks of genetic discrimination. And life insurance that you mentioned is one of them. There are also other kinds of discrimination that I'll speak about in a moment. So first, I'll say it really depends on what part of the world you're in, because different countries have different kinds of protections, and which areas people are protected from the misuse of their genetic information really varies. So I'll start with the United States. We have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is applicable just to two areas, which is health insurance and employment. And what that means is that health insurance companies can't use genetic information as a basis for discriminating against you, denying you coverage, or conditioning your premiums or changing your premiums based on genetic test results. In the employment context, there's just an absolute bar on using genetic information about making any kinds of hiring, firing, promotion, or other decisions. And it goes further than that still. Employers are simply not allowed to acquire genetic information. Life insurance companies, however, there is no prohibition. Short-term or long-term disability companies, there is no prohibition on their use of genetic information in making premium decisions and making coverage decisions. To date, there's very little of that happening in the United States, in that most life insurance companies, for now, primarily look at family history rather than looking at genetic test, but they are permitted to ask. And increasingly, there is a movement where life insurance companies are starting to use at least much more highly penetrant and informative information from genetic testing as a potential way to make choices about coverage and about premiums for an individual. When you look worldwide, those kind of categories of life insurance, health insurance, employment tend to be the big categories that really are the ones that people should be aware of and should be taking into consideration as they decide whether or not to undertake genetic testing. Some countries have entered into voluntary moratoriums or longer-term moratoriums on the use of life insurance in making decisions, in the use of genetic information in making life insurance decisions. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, first there was a concordance where the life insurance companies entered into an agreement that they wouldn't use that information. Now that's a longer-term law that will be renewed every 5 years, unless you seek a very high amounts of coverage. If it's more than £500,000, then they can ask for genetic test information to make choices about premium coverage and amounts. You see variation really across the world. Some countries, like Japan, have a voluntary moratorium. Other countries don't. Some countries cover, under their disability laws, information about genetic testing can't be used in really very many contexts at all. So it's country by country, but it kind of falls along those characteristics. Countries that have universal healthcare are the least concerning for discriminating against people based on genetic testing. Countries that have fee for service, there's a greater likelihood and a risk. So what can somebody do as a result of that? First of all, you can try to get your affairs in order before undertaking genetic testing. So what that means is, for example, if I know that I want to undertake a whole bunch of predictive testing, whether it's genetic testing or other kinds of predictive testing, like suppose I want to go in for brain scans, which might reveal decades beforehand that I'm going to develop Alzheimer's disease, I'm going to make sure my life insurance policy is in place before I do any of that, because once you have all of that information, it's fair game for a life insurance company to ask you to disclose all of that information. But you can honestly and truthfully say, I do not have any information to disclose to you with respect to this, if you are seeking out the coverage prior to undertaking genetic testing or other forms of predictive testing. So I'd say that's one thing I would do, is really put my kind of financial affairs in place. I'd put my life insurance into place. I'd put my health insurance into place. I would make sure that I was in a secure employment setting and other settings that would protect me against that. If I'm testing, and I think the testing that I'm doing has implications for family members, that's something I'm really going to think about and weigh in deciding when and if to disclose the results to other family members. And so, for example, if I test positive, having put my affairs into order and say I'm pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic for ALS, and I discover that I have a highly penetrant gene for ALS, I'm probably going to want to share that information with my family members because it implicates their lives. But I might encourage them to do the same thing, which is to get their financial affairs and life in order and help them to do so before encouraging them to undertake genetic testing, or even before I disclose to them the results of my genetic testing. And so those are some of the things that people could do, is to be able to, with a clear conscience and honestly, engage in and put their financial affairs in order, then undertake predictive testing, and then consider when the right time is to disclose to family members, to empower them to make the choice for themselves if it makes sense to go forward with predictive testing.
Thank you for providing that overview. It's definitely a key topic that keeps getting brought up, and something that patients globally need to look at their individual country regulations in order to determine what the best path forward is. So we've had this conversation about insurance now. So this discussion raises questions about ethical concerns related to privacy. So what are some of the privacy concerns related to genetic testing, and how can those risks be mitigated?
So we right now have a very spotty worldwide set of regulations with respect to data privacy and management. And sensitive and personal information like your genetic test results, it depends on where you are in the world for how well it is protected. And therefore, whether or not it's something that's kept private for you and just your physician to be able to know, or if it's something that could be accessed more broadly and potentially used or misused against you. Now, that really depends on the context and the part of the world that you're in. So for example, genetic test results have been used in a discriminatory way in some countries by state actors, and have been used to target whether it's ethnic groups or even people with particular conditions. It's been used as a basis and a justification for denying people access, for example, to reproductive technologies. And so depending on where you are in the world, there are some risks, privacy risks, that arise. Now, I generally think of those privacy risks primarily as being the consequences of disclosure of the information. For some people, privacy really is about a dignitary harm, which is if it's information about themselves, they don't want to share that information with other people, and the mere sharing of the information is itself harmful. It's information that's personal to them and they don't want shared with other people. So what can you do if you choose to undertake genetic testing, recognizing that there's potential dignitary harms, which is it's information that you don't want disclosed to anyone, or potential privacy harms that are from misuse of information, whether it's by state actors or employers or social actors, many other contexts in which that information could be misused. Well, first, I think states and governments need to enact regulations and legislation that is broadly protective of genetic information. I personally believe there is so much value to being able to aggregate genetic information, for example, from people, and what we can learn is tremendous. If everybody in the world had genetic testing done, and we were able to correlate that to diseases, we could develop therapies and treatments that would be very specific and targeted, and that would be extraordinary and incredible. But the only way people can feel comfortable sharing their information is if they know that they're not going to suffer from discrimination and from privacy harms as a result of sharing that information. Sorry, my hoarse voice keeps giving out in the fall weather here. So what can be done? I think that there is many different levels of what can be done. The first one being government and state actors putting into place regulations. I also think that the companies that are doing the genetic testing have best practices that they ought to follow. And that means that, they shouldn't be, selling the data to third parties. They should be giving people control over the data when they're undergoing testing. If, for example, somebody undertakes genetic testing in the context of a clinical trial, then I think corporations who are running those clinical trials have duties of best practices of safeguarding that information as well. And that could be, for example, maintaining the records separately from the electronic health record. Once information gets into a person's electronic health record, it can be accessed by a lot of other actors as well who have a right to access medical records. Whereas if clinical trial data is kept separately in a data management agreement, is stored where only the researchers have access to it, and is kept separate, then there's less of a risk of that. Some countries, like European countries, for example, or have the GDPR that's in place, a general privacy and data management kind of regime and regulation, which limits the processing by third parties of sensitive information and puts pretty stringent controls into place about how that data can be used by third parties, limitations on exporting the data and access it for other people. Those are good models, I think, that other countries ought to follow in thinking about especially sensitive information. And then for the person, the individual, there is a choice that they can make, which is to ask about the data management practices of wherever they're undertaking genetic testing, right? What are the privacy parameters that you've put into place? What are the data management parameters that you've put into place? I choose to share, but only to share this information with the following set of people. So they can be proactive in both understanding, but then really reading those consent forms and deciding and making choices that are privacy enhancing for themselves and that align with their own values. If their own values are they want to share the data as widely as possible, check that box. If their own values are they want to keep the information as private as possible, check that box. But read the consent forms. Don't just sign, but really understand and inquire and probe about what the data management practices are of the company or the physician or the clinic or wherever it is that you choose to undertake genetic testing.
That's such a good point. As someone who used to manage clinical trials on a day-to-day basis, the countless number of times that patients were like, where do I sign? I just enroll me in the clinical trial. It's like, no, you need to take the time to read through this. And if there's something that you need to know that you're not finding in the consent form, and ask those questions. And it's so important. So thank you for discussing that. Now, I know that digital health and AI is a topic that you're particularly interested in. And so we're living in an ever increasingly digitally connected world. I think a common example, which is in the news lately related to the pandemic, is how our medical information is being digitized, as an example, with some countries using vaccine passports. So as more of our data is digitized, what do we need to consider with regards to genetic testing data on that front?
Yeah, I mean, this is where, because it's not just on some, little card that you have at home or in a paper record that's in your doctor's office, right? It used to be that the medical records were just written down and the likelihood of leakage was pretty slim. But the digitization both introduces great promise for individuals of portability of your healthcare. I mean, one of the great hopes is that rather than every time you go to a new doctor or a new system, you don't have to fill out your family history and your own personal medical history, where so much of that information is lost. And the continuity of care is really compromised as a result. So I think the great promise of digitization of healthcare, including your genetic data and other data, is the possibility of you being able to take it from place to place, go to a new healthcare provider, provide them that data, and for them to have the context of, all of your other family members who have tested positive, for example, for ALS, or who haven't tested positive for ALS, your own symptoms over time that they might be able to track and see, and then provide you really customized care. The possibility of using artificial intelligence to analyze all of those records and to then be able to gain great insights that could guide care, right? So if you can take electronic health records of everybody who has, for example, ALS, together with all of the genetic tests and other medical tests that they've undertaken, and then learn new insights that could inform treatment, that's great promise, right? AI, I think, offers us a tremendous amount of opportunities for learning about health and acting on it. But like any great thing, it also introduces peril, right? It introduces the possibility of cyber attacks. It introduces leakage. You can't open the news any day of the week and not read about some new leakage of a lot of personal information, or you can't go somewhere and not see studies that show that it's really easy to re-identify people from de-identified data. there is a risk that the digital health world introduces. And then that risk takes us back to the conversation we're already having, which is what's the harm from sharing your data? The harm from sharing your data is really when there aren't good provisions in place to safeguard you against misuse. And when you haven't put yourself in the best possible position to be able to have planned for your own financial future and your own choices that you want to make long term, whether it's with respect to family planning or informing other family members or really thinking deliberately and thoughtfully about how you want to secure your own personal life, happiness, and livelihood. But I think the promise outweighs the risk, but it does introduce new duties, both on companies, on governments, and on individuals to take greater steps to really safeguard themselves against the potential harms that can arise.
This has been a fantastic conversation and tons of wonderful information. And really, I hope that the audience is gaining a lot of insight into what they should consider if they want to undergo genetic testing. I have so many more questions, but I'll save those for the live Q&A. I was wondering if you can wrap us up with your take-home message and what it would be for individuals living with ALS or who have family members affected by ALS who are considering undergoing genetic testing.
Well, first and foremost, it's a personal choice for whether or not you choose to undertake genetic testing. I think the risk to individuals who are symptomatic for ALS of genetic testing is very low. That is, learning that you may have a genetic cause for your already symptomatic ALS potentially just opens doors to new treatments, more precise options, and the possibility of being able to inform and potentially safeguard family members to give them the opportunity to really understand that this is something that is inherited and may implicate and apply to their lives. It doesn't come without risk, even if you're symptomatic, and that it introduces privacy risks for family members. It introduces complications and potential stress and guilt that some people experience if they already, for example, have children, they test positive for ALS and then discover or worry that they've passed that on to future generations, to their own children. But it's a personal choice, and all of those things are important to weigh. For people who are asymptomatic, but who have a family history of ALS, it introduces a new set of risks. That is, those are risks about the potential for future discrimination prior to becoming symptomatic for ALS. But I don't think that's a reason to not get genetically tested. I think it's a reason to make sure that you fully understand the risks of doing so, and that you go into that choice of genetic testing at a moment that is right for you, where you feel like you have already put into place, for example, safeguards with respect to life insurance, short-term and long-term disability insurance. You've thought about what it might mean for family planning. You've thought about what it might mean for other family members before you undertake that testing. There is another group that we didn't really talk about, and those are people who may undertake genetic testing not knowing that they have a family history for ALS, and who nevertheless discover that through genetic testing that they may have a gene that is penetrant, highly penetrant for, or moderately penetrant for, or at least contributes to ALS. And that group, because anybody could fall into that group, suggests to me that the best practices that I recommend for people who are undertaking genetic testing who are asymptomatic with a family member are the same precautions that the person who has no family history ought to take. Anybody who chooses to undertake genetic testing should realize that they may learn things that are predictive of future health implications, which can be incredibly empowering because it may help you decide what the right diet for you is, what the right medications for you are, what kinds of clinical trials you may be eligible for, what kinds of medications may be in your future, what your future may foretell and may hold. And for those people, just like the people who are asymptomatic and who have a family history, get your affairs in order before undertaking genetic testing so that you can safeguard yourself as best as possible. And everyone should be advocating for superior data management practices, increase privacy protections for individuals with respect to sensitive information like their genetic information, should be pushing the companies that they work with to undertake genetic testing to have the best possible practices and to choose companies that have better privacy and data management safeguards to do their genetic testing, and then really urging legislators worldwide to move toward robust protections for individuals so that people can feel comfortable getting genetic testing done and feel comfortable sharing it broadly so that we can learn the most possible information to have the best possible treatments that are available for individuals in the future.
Nita, thank you. You've given us such a lot of information to think about today. Thank you for being here and for joining us for this final webinar in our webinar series on genetics in ALS. And you'll join me in the live Q&A in just a moment.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the questions, and I hope that this helps people just be a little bit more prepared as they go into the very difficult choice and very personal choice about whether to undertake genetic testing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentation again, Nita, and for joining us for the live Q&A today. We've had several questions come in that I'll go through. Before I hit on the question specifically related to the presentation, we did get a question on penetrance, which maybe I'll address first because it might come into some of your answers. So we had a question about how penetrance is determined. And for anyone who doesn't know, penetrance is the probability that you will get the disease if you have the genetic mutation, to keep it short. And we determine penetrance largely by looking at families. Unfortunately, there's no single test that gives us a number. It's looking at the family history, the number of people that have been affected, and what age they get the disease at. So I want to answer that question first before we get into Nita's questions. So I'll start with this one. Can you please discuss the ethics, challenges, and issues with ALS genetic testing in individuals under the age of 18? So in minors, and we had another question on that same train of thought as well.
Probably one of the most ethically complicated questions that a person can ask, really, which is, which gets at both the age of consent for an individual, also parents making choices about genetic testing. And I'll tell you that this is a question that exists well beyond ALS. It's a question that people are grappling with across the genetic community. ALS is typically not juvenile ALS, right? So that's rarer than onset after age of 18. And that's relevant to how you think about it ethically, because what that really is asking then is, when is it appropriate for a parent, for example, to undertake genetic testing of a child who would have an adult onset disease? My own personal view of this is not necessarily the majority view of this. I would say there's no kind of great answer to this question. When there aren't treatments that are available, having that knowledge earlier, if it doesn't necessarily change how you would otherwise live your life, the question is, what is the value or the upside of genetic testing and living with the knowledge if you are a child, or the parent living with the knowledge and choosing not to disclose it, for example, to the child? And until there are good interventions or treatments that are available, there may not be a huge individual benefit, or even a minor individual benefit for a child undergoing genetic testing prior to the age of 18. The closer a child gets to the age of 18, the more likely they can make that informed choice for themselves. And I am in favor of, particularly for diseases that are generally considered to be more likely to be adult onset diseases, of waiting until a child can also be part of that conversation and make that choice for themselves, because it's information that really is personal to them. And disclosing and choosing to undertake that genetic testing should be something that they can really participate in. But some of the consequences of it, some of the weighty consequences of it, living their life with the knowledge of it, the implications for them potentially for health insurance and life insurance and other opportunities in life that could be limited by a positive test, particularly for, as Kristiana said, a highly penetrant variant, would make it an area that I'd be more cautionary about. And I'll just add one layer to this, which is there is a move toward newborn screening and potentially whole genome newborn screening that is likely to happen within the next few years, right? We're likely to see that in a number of different countries, in which case this will be moot. They're going to have this information from a much earlier age, although there will be complicated questions about when to disclose that information and how much of that information to disclose.
Thank you so much for that answer. I saw that Sandy posted a similar question in the chat. If we didn't address your question in the way you wanted us to, please feel free to elaborate. We had a question earlier on insurance as well. I think we addressed that during the presentation, but again, if there's something lacking, please feel free to add in the Q&A. Somebody in the Q&A said that one of the big problems is for some countries, there's no access to genetic testing, and sometimes they have to travel out of country to get access. And do you think that the ethical considerations are playing into that as well, or something that they need to consider in that case if it's not available locally?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely ethical considerations in countries that are making it limited. Now, that could be that they think that there isn't, that they don't want to pay for it, for example. That's one reason why some countries choose not to make genetic testing available, where they decide if there aren't interventions, for example, that are related to the genetic testing, and genetic testing still is somewhat costly, that they simply don't want to pay for it, in which case I don't think that's an ethical constraint on an individual who can afford to and chooses to undertake medical tourism that is going to another country in order to undertake genetic testing. But so usually it's about reimbursements and about paying rather than about limiting it. But there are some countries that are concerned about the discriminatory effects of certain kinds of genetic testing, and the eugenic potential. Eugenic is, states or individuals making choices that limit an ability of an individual to have children or to participate, fully in society. And so they worry about the discriminatory effect and they choose to limit genetic testing that's available. But I think more often than not, it's the former. It's a money issue rather than an ethics issue that is leading to less availability of genetic testing for individuals.
Thank you. I haven't seen any other questions come through the Q&A. We have about 2 minutes left, so I want to kind of riff off of that with another question I had after our discussion. Related to access, as we are seeing some sponsored testing panels available to try to improve that access. And so a sponsored testing panel is when the genetic testing is available free of charge. It's not like 23andMe, it's specifically targeted to a specific disease. I was wondering if you can comment on how that interplays with what we talked about with regards to data protection and privacy.
Yeah, I tend to think nothing is really free. Now, maybe that's my jaded view, but free, if it's free and truly being done without an expectation that whoever is doing the testing owns the data and can then use the data for any purposes they want, that's free, right? When somebody's providing you a service and don't expect to receive anything in return. To the extent that companies are making it free as part of greater humanitarian efforts, great. As I said, I also think that there is a great value in sharing. And so if there are sufficient data management practices in place, and if people want to contribute to our knowledge and science, to the potential for advances, that's the only way we really make progress as a society, right? Which is the more people feel like and are secured in their ability to undertake genetic testing, share that genetic information, and then we can use that to gain great insights about the etiology, the causes of disease, but also treatments that may be available and targeted treatments that may be responsive to different kinds of genetic mutations that give rise to diseases, the better off we are as human beings, and particularly with diseases that carry such a high burden like ALS. So I think it's great that there are efforts to increase the amounts of genetic testing that's available. It just has to be done in a way that also protects individuals until we have much greater protections against genetic discrimination for people of many different forms. And so, undertake that genetic testing if it is helpful to you, but ask about the data management practices and insist on really strong ones that protect you, your relatives, your family members, and other people in the ALS community as well.
Thank you, Nita. And I think that that highlights and wraps up a general theme of our conversation, which is making sure that people are making an informed decision and to ask questions. And it's their decision to make, but just make sure that they are informed and have all the information available to them.